Hi, I'm Paul and this is Game Turtle. Aura of Worlds is a platformer roguelite, with the focus being on quick thinking, strategy and exploration. I first tried Aura of Worlds at PAX Oz 2016. The developers were kind enough to offer me a copy of the initial press build to take for a spin, so just to be clear, the game is still in active development, with an early access release scheduled for later in the year. First off, the game is definitely reminiscent of Spelunky at first glance. With that said, if you're going to take cues from another game, Spelunky is a brilliant choice, and beyond that, in execution, the games play drastically different. Variety is definitely a focus in Aura of Worlds. There are numerous weapons, abilities, enemies, traps, and potential level layouts on offer here. Each attempt through the dungeons will lead to vastly differing conditions and gameplay experiences. These different entities play off each other well, and due to the procedural generation processes in place, you'll often find themed dungeons focusing on particular groupings, which are pretty entertaining. The little blurbs at the start of some levels give a taste of what to expect while remaining mysterious and exciting. Some levels have you fleeing from some form of moving death wall, and those levels are particularly exhilarating. The game's physics are really well designed. Overall, the fluidity of motion within the game is excellent. With this many traps, enemies, and dangers being thrown at you all at once, feeling in control of your avatar is essential, and Aura of Worlds doesn't disappoint. I adore games where every entity within it is governed by the same rules. For example, enemies trigger hidden traps just like the player character does, and flames can hit patches of leaves and slowly spread. It really does a lot to increase strategic options, as well as make the game space far more alive and consistent. You can definitely tell a lot of work has been put into getting all the different items, enemies, traps and abilities to play into the core of the game in a positive way. For how many of these individual components there are, I didn't find myself coming across any that weren't enjoyable, effective, or otherwise suitable to the core gameplay, which is impressive given the sheer number of options on offer. I adore the grapple hook in particular. It almost feels like Spider-Man, swinging along the rooftops and hooking around tight corners. On top of the game's already smooth movement, the grapple hook, and a number of other maneuverabilities, are a real joy. The force field ability is also suitably awesome as a result of the game's cohesive physics. Really, on the whole, the abilities are wonderfully dynamic, and bring a lot of variety to the player's arsenal each run. One thing I feel worth noting for the developer's sake is to put some sort of restriction on the timing for aiming the blink ability. It's possible to hold down the button indefinitely and cheese entire levels in persistent slow-mo, which becomes increasingly useful as the hazards ramp up. Aura of Worlds has a good level of challenge and complexity. I favour a speedrunny style of play with these sorts of games, but the game definitely has a good mix of incentivising efficiency alongside strategic planning and careful exploration. When things start heating up in later levels, you really have to stay on your toes. The game looks quite nice. All the enemies and objects are distinct and interesting, and the traps are well hidden without being unfair. I also appreciate the parallax backgrounds. I particularly like the lighting system in place. A big thing in a game like this is whether features can be understood at a glance. Danger is always present, and Aura of Worlds does a great job of this. Even in pitch black areas, you can see just enough of the level geometry and the silhouettes of enemies when up close to prevent frustration, though you never know whether it's fully safe to dive into the darkness ahead. I tried out Aura of Worlds with both a controller and mouse and keyboard. I found the grapple hook and similar abilities easier to control on the controller, but overall the aiming and inventory management felt more precise on the mouse and keyboard. Either way, the game is very playable on whichever control scheme you favour. One thing I'm not a huge fan of is the standard sword swing animation. It works similarly to Terraria, with the sword sweeping along an arc. It doesn't really feel as nice as it could, especially alongside the other really satisfying weapons. But honestly, I can understand that the game's 360-degree weapon controls necessitate this form of animation. I certainly can't think of an alternative that would provide greater style without reducing the functionality, so this is a case where functionality wins out, I suppose. Obviously, with a game still in progress like this, the immediate goal is a stable, polished experience. Aura of Worlds is already doing really well there. The foundation is solid, so what I'd like to see in the future is a healthy amount of additional variety for the abilities and enemies and such, as well as player options. I'd be interested in seeing an alternate mode where the player can influence the procedural design of the levels before they play, or some form of custom mode where they can choose the entities within the level as well as their abilities and weapons. I have heard that the developers are planning to implement a leveling system of sorts, so it's clear that furthering the scope of the game is already being worked on. On the whole, Order of Worlds is progressing really well in my opinion. With the impressive level of polish already present, what's left is really to push for even greater variety and to differentiate itself from other games. There is a really solid foundation here, and the expedition through the game's diverse levels is undoubtedly a lot of fun. It's definitely an addicting one more go sort of game. Order of Worlds is set to release into early access later in the year, so I recommend keeping an eye on the game's development progress. The game is clearly being worked on by a dedicated and passionate team, and I wish them the best of luck.